So this is our 11th week talking about some aspect of the Exodus. And when I say the Exodus, I'm talking about the book of Exodus in the Bible, but more specifically because the story is not just in the book of Exodus. It goes on into Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It's this whole 4-book story of the people of God, the Jews, starting in captivity in Egypt and how they make it to the promised land. So that's what we're talking about. And 11 weeks we've been doing this. We've been looking at different things that you can find, different lessons learned out of this great story. Now then, I've gone and I've looked back. I do this periodically. I went back and I kind of looked through some of my old sermons because I have them all on my iPad. And it seems like sermon after sermon after sermon after sermon, at least somewhere in the sermon, there's a point made from the story of Exodus. When you see Bible studies, unless they're about a particular book in the Bible, like a Bible study on the book of Daniel. If it's a Bible study on a particular topic, they're going to tell you some of it's going to be out of that story of the Exodus. It keeps coming back to that story. And then, of course, oftentimes, it keeps coming back to the other the greater story in the Bible, the story of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 4 books in the New Testament. Isn't that interesting? 4 books in the Old Testament, 4 books in the New Testament, telling the story of the life of Jesus, from his birth to his resurrection and the little bit of time he spent after that here on the earth. These are the 2 central stories of the Bible. The stories that we keep having to go back and refer to. So, at some point, we're just going to lop off our study of Exodus because there's really no end, I think, to it. How many sermons can you have out of Exodus? I'm guessing hundreds you could get because it seems to come up over and over again. We will not do hundreds on Exodus, by the way, in a row, but we've got a few more to go. And one of the things that you will see in the book of Exodus is a story from slavery to promised land is this sentence: tell everyone of the great deeds of God. Let me read this to you. Exodus 10. Then the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh. So you know where we are in the story? Just from that? This is about to be the let my people go section of the story. So here it is. The Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his officials. Why, you might ask? He's about to answer you. So that I may perform these miracles, these miraculous signs of mine among them, that you may tell your children and grandchildren how I dealt harshly with the Egyptians and how I performed my signs among them, and that you may know that I am the Lord. Why did he do all of that? Why did he harden Pharaoh's heart? Why did he perform all those miracles? Why did he send all those plagues? Well, you could come up with different answers if you wanted to, and they might be true. But this passage right here says at least one reason that God did it. And what was that reason? So that you would tell your children and grandchildren of the great deeds of God. So important was this to Moses that of those 4 books, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the 4th of those, the book of Deuteronomy. If you read it without realizing what it is, I think it can be a boring book. because it's not telling you anything you haven't heard before. It may be putting it in a slightly different order, but what it is it's Moses when he was old. They were getting close to being able to go into the promised land. He wasn't going to get to go with them. And so he preached 4 sermons. And he wrote them in, and that's the book of Deuteronomy. And in those 4 sermons, he punches one idea over and over and over again. Probably, to be fair to the book of Deuteronomy, the sentence would be slightly different. It wouldn't be tell. It would be don't forget the great deeds of God. Moses was afraid that God's blessings would be spilt and not savored. He was concerned that his people would forget all that had been done for them by their God. And that the consequences of that would be catastrophic for them. And in fact, his concern was played out. They did forget more than once. And when they did, it was catastrophe. Why would Moses do it 4? Wouldn't we get the point with 1? No, you see, Moses, and this is one of the reasons that people find these first 5 books of the Bible, we believe, written by Moses, we find it hard to read sometimes. Because he doesn't make his point once. He likes to say it 2, 3, 4, 5 times because he wants to make sure that you get it, that it sticks in your head, that you remember it, and then you tell it. You tell it. So, the very idea in the book of Leviticus of doing the Passover meal, we call it the Seder meal. A part of that Seder meal, by the way, is actually what we do when we take a Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper, that's what we tend to call it, or communion, is actually contained within the Jewish Seder meal. What's the Seder meal? Do you guys know? What's it supposed to do for you? What's it celebrate?
Remind you of the great deeds of God.
It sure does. That's a good answer. And more specifically, it is about remembering the night of the 10th plague. The putting the blood on the doorpost so that the angel of death would pass over you. The fact that but for shedding of blood, death is coming your way. Boy, that's a foreshadowing of Christ if ever there was one. Without shedding of blood, death is coming for you. So, that is what we have in that. And the very first Seder meal, the very first Passover meal was done when the actual death angel passed over their homes. They were inside doing that. They were taking communion while the death angel was passing by. They were doing that. And what did Jesus say about that? Do this in remembrance of me. That's why when you have a Lord's Supper table, what words are carved into it? Do this in remembrance of me. You've seen it in traditional churches. We had a Lord's Supper table that got ruined in our hurricane back a few years back. But that's what it said on the front of it. Do this in remembrance of me. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen a Lord's Supper table that didn't have those words on it. Always has those words carved into the front of it. And then it's interesting, we put that white tablecloth over it so we can't see it, right? But that's what we do. Remembering the great deeds of God was even important to Jesus and to his disciples. He wanted them to know and remember even the great deeds of God from before. Wow. So we must remember the great deeds of God. So we've been separated and isolated somewhat. And one of the things that happens when you're separated and isolated, go through a season like this, is we lose out on some of the stories of how God is interacting with us. We lose out on that. So my question is, what is God doing in your life? What has God done in your life in the last few months? And you know, it's one of those moments we'll all remember. We won't remember it like 9/11, where we all kind of remember where we were when that happened. Back before that, 1986, people who were around and adults during that time usually remember where they were when they heard about the Challenger explosion, when that happened. Especially people around here, when the shuttle blew up. And I've been told that everybody who was alive at the time knows exactly where they were and what they were doing when they heard that JFK was shot. And I think, though it's not an exact day, everybody's going to remember March of 2020, the month that America was closed. The month that the word COVID-19 came into our vocabulary for the first time. The time that the word pandemic ceased to be something that shows up in a Dustin Hoffman movie or a board game and becomes an actual reality. We're going to remember that. Should we live many, many years, we're going to remember. Of course, we're not done with it yet, so there'll be an ending to this, and we'll probably remember the ending, maybe, hopefully, very soon, an ending to this problem. But what of the great deeds of God in our lives? So today I want to give us a chance to share what God's been doing in your lives since the middle of March, when COVID-19 became a household name. And I don't want to do that with our Facebook Live audience. I want us to be able here to do that. So those of you who are on Facebook Live watching, or perhaps you're watching after the fact, here's my challenge to you. My challenge to you is that you would recall some of the things that God has done for you over the last months and tell someone. Go tell a friend. Go tell a neighbor. Go tell a relative about how, though you were isolated, you were not alone. Tell them about how God came and filled the needs of your heart that were just not going to be filled any other way because you weren't having all the interaction, perhaps. Some of you, maybe, you got sick, you got COVID and had a very bad experience with that. Tell us about God's part in that. How he came to your rescue, how he comforted you in the midst of that. Share that with somebody. My goodness, you could probably put it on a voicemail or a text message to some of us that are here in the room, and we'll read it when the service is over. But at all costs, do that if you would. We'd love to find out some of those stories, but tell somebody of the great deeds of God. Now then, I'm going to sign off now, and we want you to have a great, safe week. But us here in the room, see, you sometimes miss something when you don't come to church, and this is one of those. So we're going to be doing our own sharing, not on Facebook, but you go ahead and do it on Facebook. God bless you. Have a great week.